The day started out perfect. Clear skies, a light breeze, and the kind of warm afternoon that practically begged for a backyard barbecue. After weeks of planning, it felt good to finally set everything up. The grill was cleaned, the yard was spotless, and the long table under the patio umbrella was covered with trays of marinated ribs, seasoned chicken, and fresh corn on the cob. Family members had driven in from out of town. Friends had rearranged their weekends just to come, and everyone was ready to relax, eat, and enjoy the sun. From the very beginning, though, there was tension creeping in from next door. My neighbor. Everyone in the neighborhood simply referred to her as Karen behind closed doors. Had been glaring over the fence since morning. It didn't matter what I did. Mowing my lawn, setting up chairs, or even just carrying bags of charcoal. Every glance from her window carried the same disapproving look, as if my backyard existed purely to offend her. She had complained about the smallest things in the past. Trash cans not being aligned properly, wind chimes being too loud, and even the color of my mailbox. But this time she seemed especially agitated. As the first guests arrived, the atmosphere grew lively. Laughter floated in the air. The smell of barbecue coals mixed with sizzling meat, and music from a small speaker set the perfect mood. Neighbors passing by waved. Some even mentioned they wished they'd been invited. Everything was going so well that I almost forgot about Karen, until I saw her standing at the edge of her yard, arms crossed, tapping her foot like a metronome of disapproval. It was strange because there hadn't been any confrontation. I hadn't spoken to her that day, and we weren't violating any rules. The music was low enough not to disturb anyone, and it was still early afternoon. Yet, I could feel her eyes burning holes into our fun. Her body language screamed that she was waiting for an excuse, any excuse, to escalate things. An hour later, when the party was in full swing, Karen vanished from sight. No one thought much of it. Kids were running around the yard, adults were chatting, and I was focused on keeping the food from burning. But that's when it happened. A police siren echoed down the street. Not loud, not urgent, but enough to make everyone stop mid-sentence. A patrol car rolled to a stop in front of my driveway. My first thought was that something bad had happened nearby. An accident, maybe, or a lost child. But when the officers stepped out and walked straight toward my backyard, it became clear this wasn't a random visit. The officer's expression was calm but serious. He scanned the gathering, the grill, the setup, and then explained why they were there. A neighbor had called 911, claiming there was a large, unruly crowd, illegal activity, and smoke endangering public safety. It didn't take long to figure out exactly who had made that call. Karen had officially declared war over a barbecue. Guests looked at each other in disbelief. This wasn't some wild party. It was just family and friends eating ribs and potato salad. Still, I stayed polite and cooperative. The officer asked a few basic questions, checked to make sure nothing illegal was happening, and even commented that everything looked perfectly fine. He almost seemed embarrassed to be there, as if he knew his time was being wasted. But while he was talking to me, Karen came storming out of her house, phone still in her hand. She marched right up to the officer, yelling about how we were breaking all kinds of laws and disturbing the peace. Her tone was shrill, her gestures wild. The entire party watched silently as she berated the very police she had called. The officer tried to calm her down, but Karen wouldn't let it go. She accused me of everything from running a commercial event in my backyard to intentionally trying to smoke her out. It would have been comical if it hadn't been so tense. She wouldn't stop interrupting, even when the officer tried to explain that there was no violation. Then she crossed the line, screaming insults, refusing to provide her own ID when asked, and finally shoving past one of the officers to point her finger in my face. That's when the energy shifted completely. The officer's patience snapped. They warned her once, then twice to step back and calm down. She didn't listen. The more they told her to stop, the louder she got. My guests started filming on their phones, sensing that this was about to turn into something unforgettable. And then it happened. Karen, in her fury, swatted at one of the officer's hands. The yard went silent except for the sizzle of meat on the grill. It was a terrible decision, and the officers reacted instantly. Before she even realized what was happening, Karen was being placed in handcuffs, still screaming about how she was the victim and how we were criminals running a smokehouse. It was surreal watching the very neighbor who had called the cops being led toward the patrol car by those same cops. The guests were too stunned to cheer, though a few muffled laughs broke out. The officers apologized to me, saying there was no issue with my barbecue and that they were just responding to a false report. They thanked me for being cooperative, then drove off, with Karen in the back seat still shouting through the window. The party slowly resumed, though everyone kept glancing toward her now empty driveway, half expecting her to come storming back. The ribs were still juicy, the drinks still cold, but now the afternoon carried a new, charged energy. This wasn't just a neighborhood annoyance anymore. Something told me this incident wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much bigger storm. The day after the barbecue, the entire neighborhood felt different. What had started as a simple summer cookout had turned into the talk of the street. Word spread fast. By evening, everyone within 3 blocks knew Karen had been taken away in handcuffs after calling the cops on my party. Some people were amused. Others were shocked. A few, the ones who had always been careful not to cross her, were suddenly worried about what she might do when she returned. Everyone knew Karen as the type who thrived on confrontation. If she couldn't get her way, she'd make life miserable until she did. And now, humiliated in front of both neighbors and police, she had all the reason in the world to seek revenge. The morning started with subtle signs of tension. As I took out the trash, 2 neighbors approached separately just to confirm the rumors they'd heard. One admitted they'd seen the flashing lights from their living room window and had cheered under their breath. Another looked nervous, warning me that Karen would never let this go. They weren't wrong. By mid-afternoon, Karen's car was back in her driveway. She must have been released quickly, but instead of hiding in embarrassment, she acted like nothing had happened. She walked around her yard with a clipboard, taking notes on everything in sight. My lawn, my fence, even my flower beds. Her expression wasn't just angry. It was calculating, as though she was already planning her next move. The rest of the neighborhood was divided. Some avoided looking in her direction entirely, hoping to stay out of it. Others smiled at me knowingly, silently rooting for whatever drama might unfold next. Even those who disliked Karen seemed hesitant to confront her openly. After all, she had a reputation for dragging even the smallest disputes into long, exhausting battles. By evening, Karen made her first move. I caught her standing on her porch, phone in hand, pacing back and forth as if she were filing complaints to anyone who would listen. A short time later, a code enforcement officer drove by slowly, clearly just doing a courtesy check. They didn't stop, but it was obvious who had made the call. The next morning, an anonymous post appeared on the neighborhood Facebook group. It accused me of hosting unsafe events and endangering property values. The language was unmistakably Karen's. She didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. Instead of deterring me, the post had the opposite effect. Neighbors who had been at the barbecue jumped to defend me, sharing their own experiences with Karen's harassment. Stories poured out about her calling animal control on someone's harmless dog, reporting kids for selling lemonade without a permit, even trying to get a family fined for having Christmas lights up too long. What had once been whispered over fences was now out in the open. But while Karen was losing popularity, she wasn't losing determination. That evening, as I watered my lawn, I saw her on her porch again, phone to her ear, clearly escalating her efforts. This time, it wasn't just idle threats. A letter arrived in my mailbox 2 days later, a formal complaint claiming that my barbecue had violated local nuisance ordinances. It was filled with exaggerated claims, noise disturbances, illegal food sales, even hazardous smoke emissions. The complaint was ridiculous, but it forced me to take action. I documented everything: photos, videos, timestamps, even witness statements from neighbors who had been at the party. It felt absurd, having to gather evidence just to prove that I'd cooked ribs in my own backyard. But with Karen, absurdity was normal. Her behavior grew stranger by the day. She'd stand in her yard filming my property with her phone whenever I stepped outside. She measured the grass height with a ruler, probably hoping to report me for violating HOA standards even though our neighborhood didn't technically have one. Some neighbors swore they'd seen her peering through binoculars from an upstairs window, as if waiting to catch me doing something wrong. All this surveillance only made the neighborhood lean further in my favor. People who had once been afraid of Karen began to rally against her. I'd overhear conversations on the sidewalk, people openly calling her out for being toxic and overbearing. But if Karen noticed the shift in opinion, she didn't care. If anything, it seemed to fuel her. A week after her arrest, the situation boiled over again. That Saturday, I hosted another small gathering, nothing major, just a few friends for dinner. No loud music, no big crowd, just food and conversation. Still, I noticed Karen's blinds twitching every few minutes. I knew she was watching, waiting. Sure enough, just as we sat down to eat, a pair of police cruisers pulled up outside. Karen had called them again, making the same false claims about noise and illegal activity. But this time, things didn't go her way. The officers who arrived were the same ones from the barbecue incident. They knew the situation and they knew Karen. Instead of questioning me, they went straight to her door. From across the yard, I could see their body language, arms crossed, calm but stern. Karen, however, was animated, pointing toward my yard and shouting loud enough that I could hear bits and pieces. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute anymore. It was turning into a personal battle between Karen and the police themselves. And judging by how long they stayed at her house, it was clear they weren't amused. When they finally left, Karen looked rattled, her usual confidence shaken. That night, as I sat on my porch, I could feel the shift. Karen wasn't just angry anymore. She was plotting. And whatever she had planned next, I knew it wouldn't be small. The barbecue incident had embarrassed her. The neighborhood's backlash had humiliated her further. And if there was one thing Karen couldn't stand, it was losing. In the days following her second failed attempt to weaponize the police, Karen's demeanor shifted from open hostility to something far more unsettling. The furious pacing, the shouting on the porch, and the accusatory phone calls gave way to a cold, watchful silence. It was as though she'd realized that sheer outrage wasn't working anymore. So she decided to become strategic. And when Karen decided to get strategic, the neighborhood braced itself. At first, it was small things, almost too small to call out. My trash can mysteriously toppled over on pickup day, even though there hadn't been any wind. Flyers for neighborhood safety meetings appeared on doorsteps, written in her unmistakable clipped language, warning residents about unruly gatherings and code violations threatening our property values. She didn't name me directly, but everyone knew exactly who she meant. By the end of the week, Karen escalated. One morning, I found a bright orange notice taped to my fence, claiming I was under investigation for illegal outdoor cooking. It was fake, of course, just something she'd printed at home, but it was convincing enough that a few neighbors stopped by to ask if I'd really been fined. I tore it down immediately, but Karen's smirk from across her driveway told me she was pleased with the confusion she'd caused. The neighborhood was reaching a breaking point. People who had been neutral before were now openly frustrated with her antics. Parents worried about their kids being filmed when they rode bikes past her house. Retirees who just wanted quiet afternoons were tired of her dragging code enforcement into every petty grievance. And yet, no one wanted to confront her directly. They'd all seen how she twisted arguments, how she buried people in complaints until they simply gave up. I refused to give up. I documented everything. Photos, videos, timestamps of her harassment. The police officers from the barbecue incident had already told me to keep records in case her behavior crossed the line again. I didn't realize just how quickly I'd need that evidence. One Friday afternoon, a utility truck pulled up outside my house. The workers were there to inspect an anonymous report claiming I'd illegally tapped into the water line. I stood on the porch, stunned, as they explained they had to check for tampering. Of course, there was nothing wrong, but it was clear who had made the false claim. That same evening, another city department left a message saying someone had reported hazardous fumes coming from my property. Karen wasn't just being a nuisance anymore. She was trying to weaponize bureaucracy to make my life miserable. And yet, the more she tried, the more the neighborhood turned against her. People who'd once kept their heads down began stopping by to offer support. One neighbor even admitted she'd started recording Karen's rants from her own yard, just in case things escalated further. Then came the turning point. Late on a Sunday afternoon, Karen stood in her driveway shouting into her phone for over an hour. Her voice carried down the block, sharp and angry, as she complained about crooked cops and lawless neighbors. At one point she waved a stack of papers in the air, declaring loudly that she'd make sure someone paid. Nobody was entirely sure who she was threatening, but the message was clear. She wasn't done. That night, as I was taking the trash out, I caught movement near the side of my house. A shadow slipped behind the bushes, and the sound of footsteps quickly retreated into the darkness. By the time I reached the corner, the figure was gone, but a faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered in the air. I didn't see a face, but I didn't need to. Only one person in the neighborhood had a reason to lurk around my property at night. The next morning, I reviewed the footage from my security cameras. There she was, Karen herself, skulking along the fence line, holding her phone as if recording something. She hadn't technically trespassed, but the footage made it clear she was looking for trouble. I sent the video to the same officers who'd been called to my barbecue. Their response was quick and direct. They were building a case against her. By midweek, officers visited Karen's home. This time, they didn't look amused or apologetic. They handed her a formal warning about harassment and misuse of emergency services. Neighbors gathered at their windows, watching as she argued furiously on her front porch. Though I couldn't hear the words, her frantic gestures told the whole story. Karen was being told to stop, and she didn't like it. But Karen being told to stop didn't mean she would. If anything, the warning seemed to harden her resolve. The very next day, she posted an angry tirade on the neighborhood Facebook group, claiming she was being targeted by corrupt authorities and bullied by dishonest neighbors. She cast herself as the victim, painting the rest of us as villains conspiring to ruin her life. What Karen didn't know was that the police had grown tired of her games. They were no longer treating her as a complaining resident, but as a repeat offender wasting public resources. And as I prepared for another quiet weekend in my backyard, I had the feeling they were waiting for one more slip-up, one more moment where Karen went too far. That moment came faster than anyone expected. The following Saturday was calm, almost unnervingly so. The sun was bright, the street was quiet, and I grilled a few burgers for myself without inviting anyone over. I thought maybe, just maybe, Karen had gotten the message. But late that afternoon, as I was putting the food away, 2 police cruisers rolled slowly down the block again. Only this time, they didn't stop at my house, they stopped at hers. Karen burst out of her front door, already mid-argument, waving her arms as if she'd been expecting them. Neighbors came outside, phones in hand, sensing another scene. I stayed back, watching from my porch, but I could see the officers' expressions. Tired, stern, unwilling to be pushed around anymore. Karen's voice rose louder and louder until it reached a fever pitch, and then came the sharp command from one of the officers. She ignored it. Moments later, Karen was in handcuffs again, shouting about conspiracies and persecution as the police led her to the cruiser. But unlike last time, there was no confusion. No quick release in sight. This wasn't just about a barbecue anymore. This was about her entire pattern of harassment, her refusal to follow the law, and her inability to back down. As the car pulled away, the neighborhood buzzed with murmurs. Some were shocked. Some were quietly thrilled. But all of us knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to give up, and whatever she planned next, it would be bigger, riskier, and far more dangerous. Karen's second arrest sent shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. People who had once whispered about her antics now spoke openly, emboldened by the sight of police taking her away in handcuffs yet again. For the first time in years, it felt like the balance of power on the street was shifting. Karen, the self-appointed watchdog of everyone else's business, was finally being watched herself. The morning after her arrest, her house was strangely quiet. The blinds stayed drawn, the driveway was empty, and for a brief moment it seemed like we might get a reprieve. But no one believed Karen would actually stop. The question wasn't if she'd retaliate, it was how. Neighbors began comparing notes. People who had stayed silent for years stepped forward with their own stories. How Karen had called animal control on a harmless golden retriever, filed noise complaints against kids playing basketball, and even threatened an elderly couple over the color of their shutters. It became clear that I wasn't the only target. Karen had been tormenting the entire street one by one, picking on whoever was least likely to fight back. This time, though, she had gone too far. Her obsession with my barbecue, her fake complaints, her nighttime prowling along my fence line, and now her repeated arrests had turned the whole neighborhood against her. People were done being afraid. By midweek, an informal alliance had formed. Neighbors set up a group chat to share updates and videos of Karen's behavior. One retired teacher volunteered to keep a running log of every incident. Every time Karen shouted at someone from her porch, every time she followed a passerby with her phone camera. Another neighbor, a tech-savvy college student, helped people set up doorbell cameras and motion-activated lights. The street that Karen once controlled through intimidation was now organized against her. Meanwhile, Karen herself resurfaced. Her car returned to the driveway late one evening, and though she didn't come outside, her presence was obvious. The very next morning, her blinds were cracked open just enough to watch everyone on the street. It felt like living under surveillance, except now we were all watching her. 2. The police kept a close eye as well. Officers drove by more frequently, and one even stopped to reassure me that her behavior was officially under review. They couldn't arrest her for simply being unpleasant, but they were building a case in case she crossed the line again, and Karen always crossed the line. Sure enough, she didn't stay quiet for long. A few days later, code enforcement officers showed up at my door again, this time responding to an anonymous report about dangerous wiring in my backyard. Of course, it was bogus. But when I showed them security footage of Karen pacing along the fence while talking on her phone, they shook their heads knowingly. She was making herself obvious, and the evidence against her was piling up. The harassment didn't stop there. One neighbor found their mailbox stuffed with threatening letters written in shaky block letters. Another discovered their garden trampled overnight. Though no one caught her in the act, the timing was too convenient to be coincidence. Every petty act only strengthened the resolve of those around me. By Friday evening, the street felt different, tense, but united. A few neighbors gathered on my porch, sharing stories over lemonade as we watched Karen's darkened windows across the way. For years, she had managed to keep people isolated, each thinking they were her only target. Now we all knew better. We were done being divided. That same night, Karen made her boldest move yet. At around midnight, motion lights flickered on all along the block as a figure darted from yard to yard. She had started vandalizing properties, pulling up flowers, knocking over trash cans, and scrawling crude messages on sidewalks with chalk. My cameras caught her clearly this time, hood pulled up but face visible in the glow of the floodlight. She even paused in my driveway long enough to flip off the camera before running back to her own house. The footage was undeniable. By morning, half the neighborhood had seen it, and someone had already sent it to the police. Later that day, 2 officers returned to Karen's house, this time with a much firmer tone. Neighbors gathered at their windows again as she stood on her porch screaming about harassment and conspiracies. But this time, the officers didn't just warn her, they issued a citation. Karen was furious. You could feel it radiating from her property like heat from asphalt. She stormed back and forth on her porch for hours, making calls, waving papers, clearly trying to rally someone, anyone to her side. But no one came. Even the few residents who had once tolerated her wanted nothing to do with her anymore. The neighborhood's patience had run out, and so had the police departments. By the end of the week, Karen was facing multiple complaints, formal warnings, and now a fine for vandalism. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. She went online, ranting in community groups about being persecuted and betrayed by corrupt neighbors. She claimed she had proof that everyone was out to get her and that she'd make them regret it. It was clear she was spiraling. What had started as petty meddling over a barbecue had turned into something much darker. An obsession not just with me, but with anyone who dared to defy her. And as the weekend approached, There was a sense of inevitability hanging over the street. Something bigger was coming. That Saturday afternoon, I sat on my porch watching the block grow eerily quiet. No kids were outside playing. No one was mowing their lawn or tending gardens. Everyone was waiting, watching Karen's house for the next move. And then it happened. Karen marched out to her driveway carrying a stack of papers, setting up a folding table like some kind of self-declared authority. She started shouting at passing cars, waving her arms, trying to stop people to sign some sort of petition against neighborhood harassment. But no one stopped. People crossed the street to avoid her. Some even filmed her from a distance. As evening fell and her efforts failed, Karen grew more erratic. She tore down flyers from light poles, kicked over a neighbor's decorative planter, and screamed at a passing dog walker. By nightfall, the police were back. And this time, they didn't just write a citation. They told her in no uncertain terms that if she kept this up, they'd take her in again. The neighborhood waited to see what she'd do next. And knowing Karen, she wouldn't go down quietly. By the time Karen received her second citation, she had gone from neighborhood menace to full-blown pariah. People crossed the street to avoid her, and every time she stepped onto her porch, phones quietly recorded her movements. But instead of slowing her down, the growing isolation seemed to drive her into overdrive. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was desperate. In the days that followed, Karen retreated into her house for long stretches, blinds tightly drawn, only emerging late at night to collect mail or drag her trash cans in at odd hours. But even when she wasn't visible, everyone could feel her presence. Packages disappeared from porches. Cars parked along the curb mysteriously had their side mirrors folded in or scratched. The tension was thick enough to taste. Neighbors met in hushed clusters to compare notes, united by equal parts anger and fear. Everyone knew Karen was capable of petty sabotage, but no one was sure how far she was willing to go now that she'd been humiliated twice by the police. Every evening, the block grew quieter than usual, as if the entire street was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. That move came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon. I was in the backyard tending to the grill again. Not a party this time, just dinner for myself, when I heard the roar of Karen's voice echoing from her driveway. She had gathered every scrap of frustration into one public display. With a folding table set up like some kind of protest booth, Karen waved papers in the air, shouting about neighborhood tyranny and dishonest neighbors. She accused the entire street of conspiring against her, claimed she was the victim of illegal surveillance, and demanded signatures for a petition that no one wanted to sign. Not a single person stopped. Even the mail carrier crossed to the opposite sidewalk to avoid her. This public rejection only made her louder, her words sharper, her gestures more erratic. Eventually, she stormed back inside, slamming her door so hard it rattled the windows of the house next to hers. That evening, the neighborhood chat lit up with warnings. Karen was on the move again. People saw her prowling with a flashlight, peering into yards and driveways as though she were hunting for evidence of wrongdoing. Motion lights snapped on up and down the street, and cameras recorded her every step. By midnight, something more serious happened. One neighbor woke to find their front gate forced open. Another discovered tire tracks cutting through their lawn. And at my own house, a pile of garbage had been dumped against the fence. The timing left little doubt about who was responsible. The next morning, I forwarded all the footage to the police. So did several other neighbors. Officers promised they were reviewing everything carefully and made it clear they were close to taking more decisive action. Karen was no longer a nuisance. She was a documented repeat offender. But until they had an airtight case, they needed her to make one final, undeniable mistake. She gave it to them that weekend. On Saturday, I hosted a small cookout. Nothing close to the big barbecue that started all this, just a few friends sharing burgers and drinks. The mood was lighter than it had been in weeks. Neighbors walked by to wave, happy to see someone standing up to Karen without backing down. For a few hours, it felt almost normal. But Karen couldn't stand that. From behind her blinds, she watched as people laughed and plates of food passed from hand to hand. Then, just as the sun was setting, she made her move. She stormed into her yard with her phone raised high, shouting about illegal gatherings and demanding that everyone leave. When no one responded, she climbed onto a plastic step stool to scream over the fence, hurling wild accusations. My guests stayed calm, but cameras recorded every second of her meltdown. Minutes later, 2 police cars rolled down the block, summoned by Karen herself, of course. But this time, the officers didn't even approach my house first. They walked straight to Karen's driveway, where she was still yelling about smoke pollution and criminal trespassers. When the officers tried to calm her down, she refused to listen. She interrupted them, waved papers in their faces, and at one point, shoved past one of them in a fury. That single shove sealed her fate. With neighbors watching from porches and cameras rolling, the officers put Karen in handcuffs for the 3rd time. This arrest was different. The officers weren't gentle this time. Their expressions were firm, their voices sharp. They read her rights while she shrieked about conspiracies and claimed she was being set up. As they led her to the cruiser, the entire block stood still. Some stunned, some relieved, and a few quietly clapping from a distance. Karen was driven away as the last light of day faded, her voice echoing down the street long after the car turned the corner. The neighborhood exhaled in unison, but no one celebrated just yet. Everyone knew Karen's pattern. She'd be back. Later that night, the group chat buzzed with speculation. Would this arrest finally stick? Would the police press charges this time instead of just issuing warnings? And most importantly, what would Karen do if she came home angrier than ever? Even with Karen gone, there was no real sense of peace. People checked their locks twice before going to bed. Security cameras were angled to cover every inch of the street. We all felt that Karen wasn't finished, that her next move, whenever it came, would be even more reckless. And I had the uneasy feeling that, when she returned, she wouldn't just come after me. She'd come after everyone who had dared to stand against her. The sight of Karen being led down the street in handcuffs was one I would never forget. The party that had begun as a simple backyard barbecue now had an audience of neighbors peering through blinds and stepping out onto porches. The officers' expressions were firm and unreadable as they guided her toward the waiting patrol car. Karen was still sputtering, her voice cracking as she tried to twist the narrative. But nobody seemed to be listening anymore. Not the officers, not the neighbors, and certainly not me. I stood there, silent, with a strange mix of vindication and disbelief washing over me. This was the woman who had spent years inserting herself into everyone's business, acting as though the entire neighborhood were her personal fiefdom. Now she was the one being escorted off her property under flashing red and blue lights. As the car door slammed shut behind her, the atmosphere shifted. What was moments earlier a tense standoff became a bizarre sort of block party. The neighbors who had been watching from their windows now gathered on sidewalks, murmuring in low voices. Some glanced at me as if to confirm that yes, they had really seen what they thought they'd seen. Others simply shook their heads, smirking at the sheer absurdity of it all. The officers lingered just long enough to take a few statements. They assured me I had done nothing wrong. Grilling in my backyard was hardly a criminal offense, despite Karen's insistent calls to 911. What concerned them was her behavior, her refusal to comply, her verbal threats, and most shocking of all, the items they'd found when they briefly inspected her front yard. I didn't ask for details, and they didn't volunteer any, but the way one officer subtly raised an eyebrow told me it was serious. When the police finally left, taking Karen with them, a hush fell over the street. For a moment, it felt as though the entire neighborhood collectively exhaled. People who'd never exchanged more than a polite wave before were suddenly chatting on the sidewalk. They told me stories about Karen barging into their yards to criticize landscaping, about her filing noise complaints over children playing, about her arguments with delivery drivers and landscapers. It turned out nearly everyone had a Karen story, but none of them had expected the day would end like this. My guests, who had scattered nervously during the confrontation, slowly trickled back into the backyard. The grill was still warm, the food only slightly charred, and the smell of barbecue drifted through the air again. The mood shifted from tense to celebratory, though there was an odd undercurrent of disbelief. Someone joked that the barbecue was now officially the safest party in town. After all, what were the odds the cops would be called twice in one day? But as laughter bubbled up, I couldn't shake the feeling that the fallout from this scene wasn't over yet. Karen was not the kind of person to back down quietly. If anything, this arrest might only fuel her anger. I imagined her sitting in a holding cell, replaying everything in her mind, looking for someone to blame, and I had no doubt I'd be first on her list. Sure enough, over the next few days, I saw subtle signs of her presence, even while she was still away dealing with her legal mess. Her adult son came by to collect mail and scowl at anyone who passed. A large private property, an "No trespassing" sign appeared on her lawn, as if to remind the world that she still considered herself queen of the block, and rumors began to circulate. Karen was telling anyone who would listen that she'd been set up, that I had planted something to get her in trouble, that the entire neighborhood was conspiring against her. Despite all of that, there was a surprising shift on our street. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down were now openly standing up for one another. A shared sense of relief and, frankly, solidarity emerged after Karen's arrest. People started checking in on each other, offering help, exchanging numbers. The tension Karen had created for years began to lift, replaced by something almost like community spirit. Still, I knew it was only a matter of time before she came back. And when she did, she would return with a storm. But by then, everything had changed. She no longer had the quiet power of intimidation she once wielded. Everyone had seen her escorted away in handcuffs. Everyone knew the truth of how far she was willing to go to control people around her. When she finally reappeared on her porch a week later, looking pale but defiant, there was no welcome party waiting. No curious neighbors offering sympathy. Just closed blinds and a street full of people who had, at long last, decided they'd had enough of her antics. For me, the backyard barbecue that started this whole mess became a strange sort of neighborhood legend. People would mention it casually while walking dogs or tending gardens. They'd laugh about how Karen's scheme to ruin my party had backfired spectacularly, about how karma had come knocking faster than anyone expected. But privately, I couldn't help but wonder what she had learned. If anything at all. Was this her wake-up call? Or just another excuse for her to double down on her crusade against anyone who dared live life without her approval? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. She'd never look at my backyard barbecue the same way again. And neither would I. For